All right, so we now have about 20 minutes to engage in more interactive discussion with our panelists and get your questions and comments. And just the same rules apply. If you'd come up to the microphone, state your name, where you're from, and you can either direct your question or we'll let our panelists triage the question. So Bob, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. So, hi, I'm Bob Kaplan from AHRQ, and I'm also a member of the Roundtable. So here's my question. I've been very intrigued by what's happening in preventive medicine. So maybe this is more directed toward Dr. Pascual, who was talking about RCTs. And sometimes I feel like I'm living in a couple different worlds. So there is kind of the NIH world where only RCTs count. And then there's a modeling world where RCTs maybe are tended to less. Here's the challenge. Over the course of the last many years, most major RCTs in preventive medicine have shown that the intervention doesn't make much difference. In fact, if you look at NHLBI trials where the goal is to extend life expectancy, we've now gone about 20 years without a positive trial in the preventive medicine area, where almost all of those trials have positive effects for surrogate outcomes. On the other hand, modeling studies, and almost every modeling study shows that if you model using those surrogate outcomes, things look very positive. And in fact, what happens is that the modelers say that the RCT people are looking at this in too simplistic of a way. And then the RCT people are saying the models are looking at this in too simplistic of a way because that they're using these surrogate outcome measures. And so I was just wondering how you react to all of that.
Sure. Great question. So in our 2013 paper, we actually talk about that point to some detail. And the problem, so we used the Vioxx crisis as the jumping off point for the paper. And one of the points that we make is that in trying to establish through experimental design the RCTs for Vioxx, what you're doing is you're possibly, because you want all conditions to be identical as much as possible, what you're doing is you're possibly screening out some high-risk people who might have been older, people who might have had previous history of heart disease. So if you think, again, going back to the bell curve or the Gaussian distribution, these people might be in the 2%, 3%, and you're not capturing the risks associated with them. I mean, my own feeling is that the reason why hypothesis testing has come to dominate the way we think about scientific evidence is because what Neiman and Pearson did was to present a cookbook method where you could actually design an experiment and then come up with valid inferences from that. And that's why we think about causality, I think, to a large degree the way we do. While alternative approaches like Bayesian approaches, which makes use of all the information that is on hand, might have been interesting theoretically. It was not until fairly recently that we had both the algorithms and the computer power to actually run Bayesian analysis in a meaningful way. Fisher was quite prescient in one of his papers. He talked about the appeal of using likelihoods, which is similar to Bayes in that you're working with distributions. And he said the problem is we don't have the analytical tools available to make sense of distributions that are ill-behaved. You could have the Gaussian, you could have the binomial, you could have the Poisson, and these conform to analytical solutions. But as prescient as he was, he said, we don't have them yet. So he was opening himself to the possibility that perhaps one day, i.e. today, through Markov chain Monte Carlo, which is essentially taking a random walk through the data, it makes these alternative ways of determining strong causation, if you want to be a purist about it, conclusions. So the question came up, just to go back to the question this morning, is are we at a flex point that makes use of models meaningful? I would suggest that we do, because if you combine the kind of modeling that I do, which makes use of these probability distributions in multiple planes, in multiple dimensions, and hierarchically, the driver for all of that is data. It's very data hungry, but once you've got that data and it's structured in a way that you can grab the data, it's really very powerful. And as I said, it does lead one to make causal-like conclusions. In fact, well, I'm starting to dig into the weeds. I'm sorry. This is just something I really enjoy. So, but does that kind of answer your question somewhat? Okay. And I can give you sources later on that you can go to. Yeah.
Hi, John Auerbach from CDC. I wonder if you could talk about the challenges that are faced in terms of having non-homogeneous populations, and particularly subpopulations that may be affected differently by different interventions. We, for instance, a lot of times we base our assumptions about the efficacy of certain interventions based upon looking at a particular population. Maybe there was a study that examined a high-risk population, or perhaps the general population, but not a subpopulation that was had other characteristics and risks. And then we build in models that may be true for they may be true for general populations, or they may simply be based upon false assumptions about an intervention working in a subpopulation that then gets extrapolated. So given the complexity of our working with different populations, particularly populations of color, low-income populations, super-utilizers, it would be helpful to hear your thoughts on those.
It's a great question, and I think, as Ross said, there's nothing like the discipline of a modeling, the need to make explicit what you think are the sort of pathways of influence, to begin to expose the fact that if you are thinking of population differences, let's say by income status or by age or class, class and income are sort of a cluster. Maybe insurance status makes a huge difference. When you start disaggregating the population and you are planning to sort of play out scenarios of action, now you have multiple assumptions, and if you don't have data to support all those, now you have a variety of questions about the conditions under which we think things can make a difference. And you're exactly right. Sometimes you have one piece of suggestive information that often is applied bluntly across the board, but the inquiry doesn't have to stop at that point. You could say, what if there's reasons to believe that we're substantially less effective with another group, and so you can sort of look at a range of more pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. What if it's less impact and more cost with this group, or much more effective and lower cost? And the question with those assumptions is, it's not to stop the research agenda, which ought to proceed. It's a question of how critical or how focused are we with that research agenda, which interventions really do need to be tested more consistently across many different contexts and different groups. And I don't know that our research agenda, our intervention research agenda, is that clear. We have a lot of correlational research that isn't about what works what works for whom under what conditions. That's really the kind of evidence that a modeler would most want to use. So that's just my quick answer.
Also, I will add to what Bobby said, is that models also provide a framework to understand whether those assumptions that we made are important or not. So whether those differences are important. So it might be that for the question that we want to answer, the assumptions that we made about a whole complete population is not that important. But that's what the model will clarify, and will just pinpoint the things that we really don't know and we need to actually collect more information for, and that will make an impact or the driver in the final output.
So are you familiar with hierarchical Bayesian approaches or modeling techniques? So let's assume that there's this Uber distribution that we could figure out if only we had all the information that we needed. And we know that we don't. So we treat studies, populations, or different models as draws, random draws from that Uber population. And you try to estimate the parameters associated with these sub-distributions. And they all contribute to that Uber distribution. It gives you a sense of how to combine heterogeneous data. And I'll give you a concrete example. So I model baseball games during my off time, and I use Bayesian approaches. In terms of finding out the coefficients, if I broke up that general coefficient and broke it down to I need a coefficient for each individual team, it's amazing how much more predictive that model becomes. So that's one way of dealing with heterogeneity.
Okay, so we're just going to take a pause right now with our panel to have a special speaker join us, and then we will return. So keep those questions in mind.